We want to equip our students well to be able to engage with real-world problems in a serious, sophisticated, critical way. Well, I think we have no choice but to take seriously the need to introduce students systematically to different ways of thinking, to different disciplinary perspectives. Now, there are a number of different ways to do that. The tradition, of course, is very strong in the US model, where you have not only the liberal arts model, which has students studying generally for the first 2 years, usually, and then not only in the last 2 years do they concentrate on their discipline. But you also have, as part of that, distribution requirements, for example. So you might be required to take courses in humanities or natural sciences or social sciences, whatever, depending on your starting discipline. And I think that's one approach. And that's broadly an approach that's been taken here in Manchester. It's still in very early stages, but with the foundation of University College. So one of the objectives of University College is to give Manchester students, at least over time, the opportunity to take courses outside their discipline. Almost certainly these courses are going to be interdisciplinary themselves, and so will help to highlight some of the benefits of that kind of multidisciplinary approach. So one way to bring disciplinary approaches in is to have that kind of distribution requirement. Another way is to have joint degrees, and some of you may well be on joint degrees. So there's the politics and economics is a very widely established joint degree across the UK. And there are lots of other ones as well, economics and philosophy, economics and history, and so forth. And that's another way to build in a degree of interdisciplinarity, because students then get exposed to at least 2 different ways of thinking about problems. So I think that's a useful thing as well. At the LSE, we've chosen to do something which is a bit more ambitious and a bit more challenging, and as a result, I think, have ended up with something which is a much bigger task than we initially envisaged. And that is to try to go beyond what you can accomplish with distribution objectives to creating a course in which students are forced to confront different disciplinary perspectives. So not just study them in silos, the way you might if you're taking them just as distribution requirements, but rather to see how different disciplines create different insights, generate different insights into a particular issue. So for example, one of the issues we look at is climate change. As economists, we're aware of the powerful insights we get into the failure of collective action in climate change through economic theories of public goods and externalities. Right? And even game theory with the prisoner's dilemma. And those are very important insights. But what we see on the course is that actually if you add an alternative insight from international relations, then we can understand from a constructivist approach that actually international norms can play an important role in collective action, success or failure. Or if we take a more realist approach, we can recognize that actually countries sometimes act for relative gain as opposed to absolute gain, which if an economist were to model country behavior, would almost certainly focus on absolute gain. So the role of power and interests within the realist model highlight the fact that relative gains may be what countries are pursuing. So we get complementary insights from adding a different discipline. Or to take another example, economics is really good at understanding how extrinsic factors affect individual decisions, the decisions of economic agents. So we think a lot about incentive structures and extrinsic factors. But if we then take the time to look at ethnographic studies in sociology or anthropology, which help us to understand the meanings that people attach to their actions, then that can generate a deeper understanding of economic agents, not just as automatons responding to extrinsic incentives, but as reflexive agents as well. And so it can deepen our understanding of, on the one hand, the value of economic models, but on the other hand, the limitations of those models. So an alternative approach is to say, actually, the greatest value in terms of deepening your understanding of both the value and the limits of economics is to systematically explore other disciplines and to understand how those insights differ from the insights we can generate from within economics. And in many senses, can give us a deeper understanding of what we learn from economics. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And now to speak next is Paul Ormerod.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think as Zach sort of hinted, I do a lot of work with people in other disciplines like physicists, mathematicians, sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, and there's a great deal we can learn from that. But Zach was a bit more challenging. He actually sent me a number of questions to answer, which I'm going to try and do. I'm just hoping he's not going to give me a mark at the end of it. So he starts off by asking, say, what are the problems in economic theory? So I suppose I have to say, what is economic theory? And in essence, economic theory is a theory about agent behaviour. How agents make decisions, how they make choices across a range of alternatives. It describes how agents and the type of information that agents gather, and it describes the rule that they use to process that information in order to arrive at a decision. So you can gather either complete or incomplete information, and then you use some form of optimization subject to constraints to form that decision. So in essence, economics is a microeconomic theory. Now, all scientific theories make simplifications. They are not the same as reality. Even quantum physics is not exactly the same as reality. It's incredibly close. It's not the same. And in judging a theory, we say, well, how reasonable, or its application in any particular situation, how reasonable are these assumptions? And there are two assumptions about agent behaviour in economics that I think are empirically becoming less and less relevant. One of these is the assumption that agents have fixed tastes and preferences, and the second is that agents make decisions independently. We all sit there like Robinson Crusoes, we have our fixed tastes and preferences, we gather information, and then we take optimal decisions. So we do interact with each other, but only indirectly via by the set of prices. So if I buy a lot of bananas and the price goes up, then Zach is affected because of the price of bananas. But it's not that I buy bananas, Zach sees me eating them and changes his preferences as a result. Now the question is, empirically, do these things matter? In the world in which we live, are tastes and preferences fixed? Do agents choose independently? Can their tastes and preferences be altered directly? Well, what about the Harlem Shake? I mean, how did that become popular? How did I choose, if I can get the right one, how did I choose my iPhone? Well, look, I've no idea how this works. I haven't got a clue. How did I choose? There's some of you might do, but I don't. So did I choose? And I suspect this is the choice of most people over about 35 did it this way. I go into the office, a couple of young people say, does it work? You know, does it send emails? Yes, I'll have that brand. No, and that's how I chose mine. I didn't optimise, I copied. I used a different set of rules. My tastes and preferences didn't exist. They weren't formulated. This product didn't exist, 5-10 years ago. My preferences were formed in the act of consumption by the preferences, the choices that other people had already made. Now, we need behavioural rules which reflect this. It's not that economic theory is wrong. There'll be certain limiting circumstances in which those assumptions are reasonable approximations to the truth. It's not wrong. So let's say Marmite. It's reasonable to assume that people have fixed tastes and preferences about Marmite. They know all there is to know about it. They can gather information and take a choice. If we're analysing Marmite, we can use standard economic theory. Now, Zach goes on to say, well, how did this manifest itself in the crisis? How did these assumptions matter? Well, they mattered very profoundly. Vicky's already sort of mentioned this, but in two ways. First of all, the regulatory structure treated banks as independent agents. The level of risk was assessed on the assets and liabilities of individual banks. And the possibility of a systemic cascade across connected agents was not allowed for in the regulatory structure. Now, things are moving on. The Bank of England, the European Central Bank have started to look at this. But that wasn't allowed because agents were independent. And I'm not sure whether you've covered this yet, but the mainstream macroeconomic model is of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. That itself has moved on slightly in the last year or two. But at the time of the crisis, it posited that the entire economy could be explained by a single representative agent, by one agent. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, and it sounds bizarre, but if it works, it's an approximation. But if you've only got one agent, then many of the interesting questions that Vicky was talking about can't even be asked. We can't look at asymmetric behaviour of debtors and creditors in a crisis. We can't look at cascades of failure across financial institutions because there aren't any. There's only one agent. So we can't do cascades. So it mattered profoundly in that sense. It mattered profoundly in a second sense, in that one of the big problems in the financial crisis was that the models of risk themselves, in terms of the probability distributions, which were used to assess a level of risk, were assumed to be the normal or the Gaussian distribution in terms of asset prices. So extreme events could not really happen once we get a normal distribution. I mean, really big changes, and certainly not successive very large changes. But that's exactly what happened. We saw the non-Gaussian distribution of asset prices. And I'm not going to put up any slides to go through this, but these sort of fat tails of extreme asset price changes tumble out quite naturally from the mathematics of models of agent behaviour in which we allow direct interaction in terms of tastes and preferences. And there's a big literature on this. Certainly one of the things that I would teach. So it certainly showed itself very clearly in the crisis. So what are the differences? This was the third question Zach asked me. What are the differences between my view and that of, if you like, mainstream economics? Can they be reconciled? My answer to this is yes, they can be reconciled. As long as you recognise that mainstream economics is the special case and these alternative models of agent behaviour are the general case. Because certainly within economic theory, I've described the Harlem Shake. Well, there are papers in mainstream economics which describe mechanisms which can actually generate this sort of phenomenon. But they're very much regarded as special cases, rather sort of unusual cases. And the mainstream assumption is still that agents make decisions independently with a set of fixed tastes and preferences. So yes, in the part of the world, the economic and social world, well, that's a reasonable approximation, that's true. But I'd suggest that empirically, that's no longer the case in many markets and in many situations. We need to relax those assumptions. And that becomes a special case, and the role of interacting agents with evolving tastes and preferences becomes the general one. And so it can be reconciled as long as we flip the weight amongst the models. So what does this mean that we actually have to teach? Well, we've got to give people the tools that how do you think about different rules of behaviour. Once you say tastes and preferences evolve, once you say you can be influenced directly by what other people do, and your tastes and preferences, you've got interacting agents, they're coming together and influence each other. The behaviour isn't static, it evolves. We need different tools for analysing this sort of situation. And these tools are well worked out. In many of the disciplines that I've been talking about, which come together under the umbrella of complex systems, there's a well-developed methodology for doing this sort of thing. And they call it agent-based modelling. Now, economic theory is about agents. It is a form of agent-based modelling. But once we start allowing preferences to evolve, then differential calculus is not much help to us. It's actually much harder to get analytical solutions in this sort of theoretical world, which corresponds much more closely to empirical reality. Much harder to get these analytical solutions. And so we use computer simulation techniques. We use computers to do our work for us. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. In fact, this is how science makes progress. It's a long time. I mean, people don't use slide rules anymore, but that was, if you like, thinking as economists, that was substituting capital for labour. You had a difficult arithmetic problem or a multiplication problem, use a slide rule, they're extinct. Use a calculating machine, use a computer. Now, if you actually want to solve partial differential equations, which the physicists do, And it's bad news for all of us economists, because that's where they have a comparative advantage in financial markets. That's why they get employed to price these options. But if you want to solve a system of partial differential equations, well, you can fry your brain and try and solve it, but there might not be an analytical solution. So you use standard techniques of solving these things numerically on a computer, which will do it for you. Why waste your life when the machine will do the work for you? So we can program these things. So I would teach how to formulate different rules of behaviour with interacting agents, with evolving tastes and preferences, teach simulation techniques, and some very, very well-developed software for this. For example, there's a program called NetLogo, developed at Northwestern University, which is very, very well developed, very nice graphics. You can download it for free. Many thousands of people around the world use this. So it's not something which we have to make up and start from scratch. There's things we can start to put in place immediately. So I teach the use of simulation techniques, agent-based models, and this has already been mentioned several times. It's a slight leap away from that. It's a slightly different point. But I will also teach economic history. Not necessarily as such, not as a separate paper, which you might be able to do, but I would teach, say, macroeconomics through the lens of economic history. So we could take some crucial times in economic history and then relate that back to theory, the different theories. Again, what Jonathan was saying, making it empirical. Making the subjects empirical. How can we understand, for example, the Great Depression, the different macroeconomic theories? And here we have some empirical evidence about what went on. How can our theories reconcile with what happened in that period in the early 1930s? So some aspects of economic theory, we might learn about wealth effects in consumption. So a whole range of things we can learn about. We might learn, again, to touches again on something Jonathan is saying, there's a massive contrast in how the Western economies emerged from the aftermath of the First World War and the Second World War. The emergence from the Second World War, dramatically more successful. The emergence from the First World War, a major disaster, which dogged the Western economies throughout the interwar period. And a lot of that was due to the institutional structures and the willingness of people to make international arrangements. Going back to thinking about the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods, a whole range of things. So as institutions were important, as well as macroeconomic theory. We might step back to the 1970s, when there's an absolute explosion in inflation, very unusual in the Western world. A massive explosion of inflation, not in a peacetime situation. It turns out that most of today's policymakers were graduate students, and so they shaped their worldview. That's why they're so terrified of inflation. And we might go back, how did it happen? Was it a monetary phenomenon? Were institutions important? Why suddenly, after having inflation rates very similar for many years, did Germany suddenly stay at 4% and Britain and Italy go to 25%? So again, we use these empirical, these key features, these key periods of economic history to teach macroeconomic theory and filter it through in that particular way. So this is how I would evolve the curriculum. I would still allow mainstream agent behaviour to be taught, as long as you recognise it's just simply one of a number of ways in which agents can make rational choices. And I'll just finish on this note. The thing that I admire about economists, and I still count myself as an economist, despite writing this book, The Death of Economics, is a brilliant success in propaganda. So they call their model of agent choice rational behaviour. And in that sense, it's been used in a very specific, limiting scientific definition. It describes the postulates which underlie their model of how agents make decisions. And they call that, in their scientific jargon, rational. So in any other behaviour is irrational. Now that's a very precise scientific use of the word. But of course, in everyday English, rational means, that's good. Irrational, bad. I would say there are a number of models of of rational choice. If you live in a world in which preferences evolve, in which agents influence each other directly, you better have a different rule for describing rationality. In that sort of world, it doesn't make sense to use the mainstream model of economic theory. So there is your thoughts, and I'm looking forward to at least Zach buying me a pint later, either in consolation or in congratulation for the answers that I've given.
Thank you very much, Paul. And now our next speaker is Ken Tuck.